Welcome to Rise Up Voices from the Frontlines, your window into relationship, identity, safety, emotional awareness, regulation and intelligence, unleashed potential, passion and purpose.
Hello, everyone. Words can be used as weapons or lifelines. Welcome back to Rise Up Voices from the Frontlines, and this is a trauma-informed leadership series episode. I'm your host, Krista Fee, and today we're going to talk about something that makes or breaks every system, every relationship, and every organization: communication. Words are not neutral. They can be weapons that corrode trust or lifelines that tether people together when everything else feels like it's falling apart. When systems collapse, it's almost always because communication rotted from the inside. Secrets, assumptions, blame, shame, all of it eating away like termites in the foundation until the whole structure gives way. That's why I developed the Rise Up rules of engagement. They are deceptively simple, but they have the power to keep organizations, families, and entire movements from tearing themselves apart. These are not just nice to have guidelines. They're survival skills for leaders who want to rise up different instead of reenacting old harms. So let me give you the Rise Up rules of engagement. No blame. Focus on the facts, not finding fault. No shame or guilt. Validate feelings without weaponizing them. No mind reading. You can't assume motives. Ask clarifying questions. And even deeper, no assumptions. Seek evidence before drawing conclusions. And no name calling. Maintain dignity even in the midst of conflict. Simple, right? But let me tell you, when applied consistently, these change everything. A few years ago, I was invited to work with the police department after a series of internal scandals. Morale was literally in the gutter. Officers didn't trust their command staff. Citizens didn't trust officers. The culture was poisoned by gossip, blame, and defensiveness. In one of the first meetings, an officer said, "Every time I raise a concern, I get blamed for being negative." So I stopped talking. That's how systems collapse. When people stop talking because communication has become unsafe. Don't think silence is peace. Silence is suffocation. We introduced the Rise Up rules, and at first, as you would expect, people rolled their eyes. No blame in law enforcement. Blame is baked into the DNA. We investigate fault. But as the conversations deepened, they realized something. Blame inside the system wasn't solving problems. It was multiplying them. When they began shifting to fact-based discussion instead of finger-pointing, tension started to ease. Officers could raise concerns without fear of being shamed. Leaders learned to ask clarifying questions instead of mind-reading motives. And over time, trust began to rebuild. Not because scandals disappeared, because they didn't, and actions will always have consequences, but because communication stopped reenacting them. So let's explore the science of destructive communication. John Gottman, one of the leading researchers on relationships, talks about the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse in marriage: criticism, contempt, defensiveness, and stonewalling. He found that when these behaviors dominate a relationship, collapse is inevitable. I know organizations are not marriages, but they do operate on the exact same human nervous systems. Criticism, contempt, defensiveness, and stonewalling are just as lethal in the boardroom as they are in the bedroom. Criticism turns into blame-laden performance reviews. Contempt shows up as sarcasm, eye rolls, and us versus them mentalities. Defensiveness shuts down problem solving, and stonewalling creates silence where dialogue really needs to be. These rise up rules are designed as anecdotes. No blame disarms criticism. No shame cuts contempt off at the knees. No mind reading and no assumptions kill defensiveness before it even begins to fester. And no name calling stops stonewalling and contempt from escalating into open warfare. When leaders embody these rules, they're not just improving communication, they're literally rewiring the relational nervous system of their entire organizations. And this one goes out to every family that I've ever known. For some, it's much of the time. For others, only once in a while. But most of you will know this scenario. So let me take this down to the micro level. I once coached a family that had been fractured by years of yelling matches and slammed doors. The parents blamed the kids for being disrespectful. The kids would throw contempt back in the form of sarcasm. Defensiveness ruled every interaction. And we started practicing the rise up rules, especially around the dinner table. And at first it was clunky. No blame felt impossible. But over time, they began to catch themselves. Oh, wait, that was an assumption. Let me ask instead. And one evening, the teenage daughter broke down and said, "This is the first time I feel like I can talk and not get shut down." That's the power of clean communication. Systems heal when people stop using words as weapons and start using them to build bridges. So why does trauma demand clear rules? Trauma pulls people into survival states, that fight, flight, freeze, or fawn that we talk about so often. And in those states, communication becomes reactive. Leaders lash out, teams retreat, families shut down. And that's why systems coming out of collapse can't rely on good intentions or just be nice. Trauma requires structure, boundaries, and protocols. The Rise Up rules act like a trauma-informed communication SOP, standard operating procedure, in case you've forgotten. And they take reactivity out of the driver's seat and give people a clear, accountable framework. They're never about silencing emotion, rather channeling it into dialogue that doesn't destroy. So let me tell you about a nonprofit that was saved by these rules. I once worked with a nonprofit that had just survived a major financial scandal. The board was fractured. Half wanted to fire everyone, half wanted to bury the past and just move on. Every meeting devolved into shouting matches and walkouts. But when we introduced the Rise Up rules, the first board meeting looked different. Instead of blame, we listed the facts, what happened, what was lost, what steps had been taken. Instead of shame, we validated the anger in the room. Of course you're furious. Of course you feel betrayed. But we didn't weaponize it. Instead of assumptions, we asked questions. What safeguards do we need so that this never happens again? By the end, people were still angry, but they weren't reenacting the trauma. They were building from it. 6 months later, the nonprofit not only survived, but rebuilt stronger. Why? Because communication stopped being corrosive and started being constructive. So here's a practical breakdown on how to get tactical. Here's how you can embed them into your systems. Start meetings by naming them. We're using the Rise Up rules today, and it sets the tone and sets expectations. Call time outs when rules are broken, not as punishment, but as accountability. Model them relentlessly. Leaders who shame, blame, or assume in public will lose all credibility. Integrate them into policy. Make them part of your HR manuals, charters, covenants, whatever it is for your organization. And then celebrate the wins. When conflict happens without collapse, name it, reinforce it, celebrate it. Because the point isn't perfection, and progress isn't lost when mistakes and missteps happen, and they will happen. The goal is creating a culture where dignity is protected, even in times of disagreement. So let me tell you personally why I built these rules. I built the Rise Up rules because I've lived what happens when words are used as weapon. As the throwaway daughter of a trafficking victim, as a survivor of childhood sexual abuse, as a woman who has endured domestic violence, I know what it feels like to be silenced, blamed, and shamed. I also know the power that words used differently can have. I wouldn't be here if I hadn't experienced voices that validated, questions that sought truth, conversations that honored my dignity instead of destroying it. These rules are not theory to me. They are literally lifelines. They're the difference between systems that consume people and systems that rise up. The phoenix of communication. Communication is the fire that either consumes or transforms systems. The ashes of broken words can destroy trust for generations, but words used wisely can ignite movements, heal families, and resurrect organizations that are on the brink of collapse. The phoenix doesn't rise without fire, and systems don't rise without dialogue. But that dialogue must be disciplined, accountable, and trauma-informed. The Rise Up rules are not about being soft. They're about being strong enough to choose dignity over destruction. So here are a few questions you can ask yourself when you're ready for some deep self-reflection. Which of the Rise Up rules do I tend to break most often? And how does it impact my system, my family, my life? Where in my leadership can I introduce these rules as survival protocols, not just suggestions? And you might even be thinking self-leadership here. Who in my system needs me to model communication that heals instead of communication that harms? Words that make systems rise. Here's the truth. Systems don't collapse because of one singular crisis. They collapse because of years of toxic communication left unchecked. But systems can also rise when words become bridges instead of weapons. The Rise Up rules of engagement are not flashy. They're not complicated. But don't take them lightly. They are transformational. If you lead, if you parent, if you serve, if you care, use them. Because when communication changes, systems change. And when systems change, communities heal. Thank you for joining me today on Rise Up Voices from the Frontlines. Please share this episode with someone who needs new rules for hard conversations. Because if we all change how we speak, we can change how we rise up. And join me in the Rise Up Trauma-Informed Leadership course and community, or have us come to a custom training or keynote at your organization, event, or seminar. We can even offer IACET CEU credits. And as always, feel free to ask me anything. I'm an open book. Use the link in the show description to schedule a complimentary consult.
Become a Rise Up Hero sponsor to provide mental wellness and crisis response resources for those who serve country and community. Join us in the Rise Up movement today.